Alright, so we're going to cover PHP with JSON. JSON is a very popular alternative to XML. In fact, Twitter, for example, only uses JSON. It stopped using XML. And the reason is, as we're going to see, it can be easier to style, and most importantly is the overhead with it. It's a lot smaller. Now, in this example, I'm not following certain best practices, but I will note where I'm not following best practices, and mostly it's because I don't feel like actually doing a full-on development of this. But for the most part, it will work and do everything it's supposed to do. So, for example, I didn't have a semicolon there, but I only have one style element, so I don't technically need one, but just to be on the safe side, I'm going to add one. Actually, this is stupid of me. I'm switching from PHP to JavaScript. When you switch notations, it can be kind of confusing, and you got to keep it in the back of your head of which one you're actually using. And that all looks correct. Okay. So the first thing is we have this little input file, and what it does, let me clear everything out here, is that when you load it, it shows you a restaurant name, a rating for that restaurant, a location, and asks you to describe your experience there. When you click Submit Review, it uses the HTML5 forms, and what those do is they allow you to make sure that the user has input data and they've input in the correct data. So right here, this is the number field. If I put in a string there instead, it's going to warn me that I need to enter a number. So set that back to 4. The description box is optional, but I'll go ahead and say best woutons ever. I don't know what a wouton is, but there it is. And in this little box down here, what I've done is I've shown you what PHP does with this whenever it outputs it. And I'm going to change that to process it in just a second. So up at the top here, I have an include once, and I have a folder called includes. And what this allows me to do is to keep my code what they call dry. Don't repeat yourself. So if you have dry code, it means you've minimized how often you're repeating yourself in the various areas. And PHP has 4 ways that you can include a file from another location. You can use include, and then whatever the URL path is, you can use include once. And the difference here is that when you use include, it will always include the file, even if it's been previously included, whereas include once makes sure that it's only happened one time. You also have require and require once. And the difference between require and include is that if you have your errors set to on, which I do, and you attempt to use include, you're going to get a little warning, but you're not going to get a fatal error. So the page will keep running, but it will print out a warning saying, hey, you attempted to include this file, but we couldn't find it. Whereas require will give you what's called the white page of death, which is where it'll just stop loading. It'll say, I was looking for this, I couldn't find it, and you need to stop running the page from this point on. You can either do it like this, just as a basic string, or you can put it inside of a set of parentheses. I prefer to use the parentheses. But personal preference, you can do it with or without. I just think it makes it a little clearer what I'm doing. Inside of the header file, all I have is the basic boilerplate. The first thing I have is the date default time zone set to America Chicago, and that's just so when I display errors, it doesn't warn me that there's no time zone set. Then I have a header saying that my content type is text HTML with a character set of UTF-8. And that's just for the JSON encoding, as it doesn't understand things that aren't UTF-8. And whenever I try to validate and sanitize my input, PHP needs to know what character set I'm using. And then I set INI set to display my errors, and that's on a 1. This is a way to, on a per page basis, set your configurations up. If you set them in the PHP INI file, that's a global setting. And for right now, I'm only setting them up locally. Then I have the doc type HTML, the language is English, and the character set is UTF-8. Then a title and some CSS. And this CSS comes from the getbootstrap.com website, which is from Twitter Bootstrap. And that's just that way I can have, a little nice styling rather than just having, HTML defaults, which isn't very pretty. From there, I have a body with a style of 25 pixels up top, just to put a little breathing room up there. Then I set a div class with a container fluid, and all that does, it just makes sure that as I resize the page, it resizes dynamically. Then I use call-nd6, and what this does is that Twitter Bootstrap is based upon a 12-column layout, and 12 columns are really popular because 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, they can all be multiples, or factors rather, of 12. So that makes it really easy to figure out how you want to lay out your page. Then I have this isSetGet and this isSetError. We'll see those in a minute. So for right now you can ignore them. Then we have our form, and what a form allows you to do is to submit data to a web page. And that's what happened when I click Submit the Review, is it submitted the data and then it output what I submitted down here. And in order to submit it, you have this action in this method. That's how do you want to submit it, and then where do you want to submit it to. And the pound sign right there just means submit to self. So it just means when I click submit, it submits it to itself. But I'm not doing any processing here. This is just to demonstrate what happens. Then you have this label for, and if the restaurant label for equals the ID of an element, then what happens is whenever you click it, it will jump the cursor to that particular field. This was designed for people who have palsy or other handicaps. That way they can their hand shake. So this makes it easier for them to select a text field. And then there's the placeholder attribute right here. And what that does is it makes sure that there's some default setting that tells people what I want them to do, or in this case it just really repeats the same information they already have. But I could, for example, right here under rating have something a little more descriptive like numbers only. So that way before they try inventing their own skill, or their own rating system, they will know that I actually just want numbers. And if they put their input, their cursor inside the input field, and they press up and down, it'll let them go between 0 and 5. That's being set by the min attribute and the max attribute. The class of callMD6 just says it's already been half, so then give me half here and then half over there. Location is just text, and hopefully you know what that is. Then I have a little spacer here, and that's just to create some more breathing room again, up here and down here. And then I ask them to describe their experience, and I'm using the text area attribute. Most of it is being set by HTML. So, actually HTML, the CSS from Bootstrap, so I'm not worried about styling this, but that's what calls and rows can do for you. Then I have another paragraph tag, and the AND-MBSP means one character space of white space, and that's just to make sure. Sometimes I found browsers will ignore things if you do it like that. So I usually just put this there just to make sure that it understands that I want to actually render out the white space. Then we have the input of submit, and that's going to submit the form. And the way PHP does it is that whenever you have anything with a name attribute, so input name, these names are going to be the array keys. So each of these different name fields becomes the array key that it looks for. And then I close out the form. Finally, I have this pre-tag, and what that does, it means preserve white space, or pre-form as what it actually means. And all that does is that it says, have there been post variables set? And if the post variable has been set and it's not empty, then I want to print recursively every single variable that's in post. So this loops through the array and prints them all out, and if that isn't the case, then it's just going to print out no variables have been set yet. This is what's called the ternary operator. So the first thing is the condition to evaluate, and that's this. If that happens to be true, do this. If it happens to be false, do that. I like it because it's nice and concise. It allows you to see what's going on in one line. But it's equivalent to just using an if-else statement. And at the very bottom, I'm including my footer.php in my includes folder. And what that does is it just gives me some JavaScript to work with. I'm not using any JavaScript on this page, but I still have it anyway just because. And this is the result of that. Now, right now, the end result is that whenever the JSON starts getting populated, it's going to go into here. And so right now, it just says no refs have been found because I have not even created the file yet. So I'm going to place a JSON file in storage, and that's what I'm going to use in order to populate the fields. But first, I need to tell it that I actually want to use process.php. And so what should happen is that if I now go, I have to refresh this so it knows that changes have been made. So name, I'll do Mr. Ying's Wu-Tang for Baton Rouge, best woutons ever. And whenever I process this on the other side, I'll be using trim, and the reason why is because you can actually place your cursor anywhere and it'll allow you to start typing from that point. So I want to make sure that whenever they start typing, that white space gets ignored. So trim will get rid of the white space here and the white space up there. So now when I submit my review, alright, so it's submitted, and then it returns back that something was added to the list. Now inside this process.php file, it looks fairly complicated, and there is some complicated stuff going on, but it's nothing too much. So the first thing I do is I repeat what I had in the header file, and I do this because the header file also includes HTML information, and I don't want to have any HTML information in here. I just want PHP processing, as the name implies. So the first thing is I use the post variable. This is what's called a super global. A super global is something that can be accessed from anywhere. So most things inside of PHP follow what's known as block scoping, which means that a block is anytime you have one of these things. This is a block. And there are certain blocks where it will limit the code. And basically anything inside the blocks is considered local, anything outside of it is considered to be global. Now, that's not entirely accurate. I'd have to give a little demo of scoping rules. But basically, whenever you declare things outside of here, anything inside of a block has access to it. But if you declare a variable inside of here, anything outside of it doesn't have access to it. So superglobals are meant to be a way of retrieving information from anywhere at any time. The array map, I know this post is an array, and this allows me to call a function, and every element of this array will have this function applied to it. In this case, I'm applying the trim because, as we saw in my little demo down here, I can have white space, and I want to make sure that there's no white space or I'm going to end up with a cluttered JSON file. Then I have errors, which I'm setting to be an array, and typically this is how I do my error reporting. I create an array called errors, and then I add an element to the array each time there's an error, and then I display that back. Now on Chrome, most of these errors are not going to happen because we're using HTML5 validation, and so it stops it on the main page. But JavaScript can be turned off, and people can use old browsers. So you should never depend upon HTML5 to sanitize your data or to validate it. Those are really just there for the user's convenience, not there really to save you. So then I have Json Options, and the way that PHP will sometimes demarcate multiple options is with this pipe symbol. So if I wanted to convert hex tags, I could do that. If I wanted to, or convert tags to hexagonal values, I could do that. I convert ampersands to hexagonal values, I convert apostrophes to it, or quotations. I'm not actually using this, it's just there for demo. I am using the Sanitized String options. And what this does is that PHP has built-in filterings. And it's really important to know, and what makes being a web developer hard when it comes to security, is that everything you do has a particular context. So JSON has its own particular context in its way that it needs values to be stored. And so I'm using PHP to strip out things I don't want. I don't want it to encode quotes because that could cause problems. So I'm telling it not to do it. I'm also telling it that I don't want it, or excuse me, that I want it to strip out what are considered low ASCII characters. So JSON only understands a subset of the UTF-8 language, and if you have certain variables put into it, then it'll cause problems. And the same thing with the high ones, the high ASCII characters. These ones here aren't really so much a problem. It's stuff like if you've done Java or some of the other ones, you'll see things like R or N or T, which is return, new line, and tab. And those are in the lower values, and it'll strip those out of there. The high ones are the ones you usually have to watch out for, and so I'm getting rid of those. Then I'm calling isSetPost, and so inside of our input thing we had the names and the restaurant name, so I'm looking for a post with the value of restaurant name, and this square bracket notation is how you access a named array. So this is the key, and then the value is whatever's inside of there. So this says I want to get post, and I want to get a post with the key of restaurant name. And we saw that whenever we saw the values down here, that where it said restaurant name, That was the key. Then I'm saying if that exists, or if it's set rather, which means that it was sent over, then I wanted to do some filtering on it, and I want to filter out the string. So I want to make sure that the string is clean, and the way I'm going to do that is with these options right here. And I put into a variable because unfortunately the downside to PHP's filter var is that it's incredibly verbose. And normally what you would do is you would write your own custom function, and that would automatically do what you wanted to do rather than having to pass in all of this stuff. But for such a small file, I'm not going to do that, but that is considered best practice. As most people will write their own filtering stuff, or they'll create a class and then call filtering either as a method property, or excuse me, a method, or as a object method. And then finally, it's using the ternary operator again. I'm saying add to it, this is an index array, create no restaurant name given. And most of the other stuff does the same thing, except for on ratings I'm using filter sanitized number int, so I want to make sure that this is an integer. And if not, then I'm giving errors, no ratings given, and running on through. Then I call if empty errors. So basically what I'm saying now is, even though I declared errors up here, there's nothing inside of it. And if everything went well, then there will be nothing inside of it. But if something went wrong, then it's going to have a value inside of it. Then I'm declaring where I want to store my JSON file. So that's this right here. And then I'm saying if the file does not exist, then I want to use the touch command. And what that does is it's a Unix command, but PHP supports it for any OS. Well, Mac is built on top of Unix, so that doesn't matter so much. But if I said touch this file.txt, then you see that it created a file called this.txt, this file.txt, but it's just a blank empty file. That's all it does, it just creates the file. So I'm saying that I want to create this file. Then what I want to do is I want to encode all of the post data into JSON format. So this will take all those variables and turn them into JSON and store it into this variable. And that's what my little comments down here say, is that we need to turn this into a JavaScript object notation. And JSON, when you open it up, it looks like this. From there, I'm going to look for, so if the file does not exist, touch it and then do the JSON encoding. Else, that means the file has been created, so now I need to know, is it an empty file? So I could create the file and just not have anything in there. So I'm going to use this file get contents, and what that does, it just grabs everything inside of any file and it stores them into a variable. Now this is memory intensive because when you think about what it's doing here, it's just grabbing all the data and chunking it into there. And so if I have a really large file, this can start to cause some serious problems. For right now though, it's a convenience method of having to manually loop through storage and do this. But it is less memory efficient than actually doing the loop itself. Then we're using the empty function again, but this time we have the not operator, or the negation operator, which says if it's not empty, which means there's already data inside of it, then I'm going to run into a little bit of an issue. And the issue I'm going to run into is that if you try to just append more JSON data into it, it's going to be invalid. It follows a very strict and specific syntax, and it must match exactly. And the only way to do that is to decode it. And so I'm decoding whatever was put inside of here. And then I'm passing it the option of true, which means that I don't want to make it into an object because this is a JavaScript object. It's going to try to create a PHP object by default, but that's a little harder to work with than an array. So this, putting this to true, says make this an array, don't make it into an object. So now I've taken all the information outside of it, and this returns a string. So now I've got just a string, which basically is just this data right here. Then I'm using array merge recursive. And what this is going to do is it asks me to give it two arrays. So the first one being the JSON decode, and the second one being the post. Excuse me, this is a string, this is an array, so that's what this is. And it's going to merge the information inside of both these together. The recursive, what this does is that if you look at the JSON data, if I was to put more stuff in, it would have restaurant name, they would both have rating, they would both have location, and they both have description. If you just use array merge, what it's going to do when it sees these two things with the same name is it's going to throw away one of them. So only one of them will emerge the picture. If you use recursive, then what it's going to do is it's going to give you both of them. So that's why I'm using this here. Finally, I'm creating a value of JSON, and I'm re-encoding all this back into JavaScript notation. However, if the test empty storage was empty, then I'm just going to do the same thing I would have done if this file had never been created. Then I'm using file put contents, and that's sort of the opposite of file get contents right here. This just takes everything, and it says first, tell me where you want to put it, and I want to put it into the storage object, and then what do you want to put in there, and that's the JSON. And then finally, I'm giving a variable called restaurant name, and I'm URL encoding the restaurant name post data. So whatever I passed in this case it was Mr. Ying's Wutan, and I'm URL encoding it, which is what creates this kind of funky looking string of text up here. That's from URL encoding. But I need to do that because I'm passing it via the URL. So just as how I have to encode JSON in order for it to be effective, I have to URL encode stuff if I want to put it in the URL. And then finally, I'm setting a get variable called success. I'm setting equal to true. This ampersand means I'm going to create a separate get variable, which is restaurant, and I'm going to set it equal to the restaurant name. So now when I go back to my input field, I say if set get success. So right here, there is our success variable from the get. If that exists, then I'm going to decode the restaurant. So I'm going to take that garbage that's up inside of here. I'm going to re-put it back into regular old text data. Or actually, in this case, it's going to be HTML data. It's HTML encoded. And then I'm going to say you have successfully added the restaurant, whatever that is, to the list. Now, if all this failed, so remember there were errors up here. So when I put my cursor right here, and I look up, usually it'll give you like some indication, of where things begin and end. So that's saying if all this failed at some point, then I want to echo out the errors as error. This for each loop just takes every single array of errors and creates one variable out of it each time it runs through. And this will be empty at first, but then I'm going to append the error onto it. And I'm going to keep loading in more errors onto itself. The dot equals operator is short for saying error equals error dot error. Or error equals, it's error dot error. Which is kind of silly looking to look at it. So that's what the dot equal operator does. It says take the original error and then add this error into it. Finally, we take all that, we encode it just like we did before, and then this header right here, what that does is it tells the page to redirect itself back to wherever it originally, or to not where it originally came from, wherever I tell it to come from, and then I print out my errors. And in this case, I screwed up because I'm using JavaScript notation, not PHP notation. It should look like that. In fact, I'm being silly about it because this is PHP, and since I'm using the double quotes here, I can allow it to just dynamically insert the error right there. That's the best way to go about that. So, all that means that now, oops, not that, but now when I refresh it, I get the restaurant name of Mr. Ying's Wutan with the restaurant rating of 4 and a restaurant name of Baton Rouge, LA. Now this is coming from using the filter string, and what it's doing here is that it's converting the apostrophe, which can be a dangerous character, is converting it into its HTML equivalent right here. So that's why we're seeing this little thing right here. Okay, and I fixed a little JavaScript error I had made, but that's perfectly okay. So now we see the restaurant name and what our user experience is about it, or a little description. So once our output passes, it processes all this, and then it puts this in the output page, which just looks like this, which looks like not a lot's going on. But all the power comes from this output.js file. And what happens there looks really complicated, and it is a little bit. So the first thing we do is we call a GET request, which is going to go to the URL storage restaurant.json. And this is all using Jquery. Jquery, one of its most powerful features is it makes it really easy to work with Ajax. And we're going to declare the data type of JSON. Then what we have here are what are known as Jquery Promises. And what happens here is Jquery supports what's known as chaining. It's one of its other really powerful features. But it allows you to call things sequentially, like first do this, then do that. Whereas in JavaScript, a lot of times you write var this, var that, do this, do that, line by line like this, rather than be able to call one group of things one after the other. And the way I wrote this isn't the most memory efficient or the easiest way to read it, but it is the laziest way, and so for a first shot at it, it'll work just fine. So what happens here is that when I reload this, we'll take a look at it. So I get this object back, and this is the data object. So what I'm saying here is that when it's done, which means it succeeds. Down here at the very end, you'll see the fail, and of course that means that it didn't work. So when I call done, I'm going to call a function. And it's going to pass in the data object a text status, which I'm not using, but I passed it in anyway, and then the actual jQuery header response, which is what you get back from the browser, which is this thing right here. Nope, that's just the name of it. I'm not actually passing that in. We'll look at it in a second. So the data object I get has description, which is the best futon ever. Then a location, Baton Rouge, LA, Louisiana. Rating of 4, and restaurant name of Mr. Wings Wu-Tan. You'll note that JSON passes everything as text, so there's no integer or floating point or other types. It's all going to be passed as strings. Now you'll note this one down here, and that's from using the PHP filtering function. And what it does is that it prevents people from using what are known as XSX attacks, which basically means they would attempt to include some sort of HTML. So script type equals JavaScript, text JavaScript. And then what they could do is just how I use a GET request to pull in data. They could then remotely execute some arbitrary code, and then that would execute on my server, and that would allow them to attack people with it. So by using this encoding here, it prevents any sort of executable character, and allows me to pass it into the HTML just fine. So the first thing that happens is I just create some divs and a block quote container, and then I convert the data into a variable called JSON. This is how JavaScript looks. If you didn't have JavaScript with me, then some of this might be unfamiliar to you, but we'll be covering that more and more as time goes on. So then what I do is I have a variable name, and inside of my JSON object here, you can see, let me flop these around, I have one called description, and let me just do this. If you right click here and store as a global, then it enables you to get things. So I have in JavaScript, you get things usually using the dot notation. So I have dot restaurant name and dot rating. So I'm using this to pull it out, and so I have to type out all this. I have a shorter version of it. Right here, if you want to declare multiple variables that are just going to be initialized to blank, you can just use a comma to separate them. You can do that with these as well, but I'm just using the one per line just because it's a little easier to read. And then I'm using jQuery to grab the container object that's right here. And all I'm going to be doing is appending all the different elements onto it. Now that's very memory intensive because it has to keep creating a new object and then appending it to there, then looping through and creating a new object. So this is not a very memory efficient way to do this. And then what I'm doing is I'm asking what type of thing, oops, spell it correctly, what type of thing is temp1.restaurant name. The first time through it's just going to be a string because the array merge hasn't been called yet. So everything here is just string data. So I say if it's string data, then just run through, create a div with the text of a restaurant name, then create another div which is going to place the HTML of name. So the first time the reason why you saw the this stuff was because I used text. Whenever you get things, so let me just inspect the element here, the old-fashioned way. If you click over here, you can toggle the console on and on, and pull this up. And basically, if I ask, there's no really good way to get that. So, document.get elements by class name. This is called MD3. There's all of them, and as I hover over it, it's going to tell me which one I want. And I want that one, so that's number 01. So I'll call this 1. And I'll create this as a variable, which I will call ying. Okay. So to inspect an element, you do console.dir. And what this does is that it gives you the various things you have access to inside of JavaScript. And you can either get access to its inner HTML or its inner text. And if you have an encoded string, so this made safe for HTML, and you encode it as text, then they're going to get the funky looking version of this version. If you encode it as HTML, HTML is going to re-encode this back into its original apostrophe and put it in there. So that was the error that I had, was I had used text instead of HTML. Oops. Put that back or I'll get another weird result. Why? Okay. But for these ones right here with restaurant name, that's perfectly fine because I'm just outputting literally restaurant name, rating, etc. So it just does that all the time. This append here inside of jQuery, which we're not covering really yet, but you can either, I think that's the element, you can either, so if I say .after, that will put something after it. So if I look at my elements here, this is after the div container tag. I can also put something before. Well, that doesn't make any sense. This is before. Inspect that. Delete that. There we go. So, and this is a really handy tool. If you don't know how to use this, the Chrome Inspector, then you're missing out on life and you'll be a bad web programmer. Fortunately, Code School, when you go to view our courses, they hide it, but somewhere in here, it's underneath electives. They'll have stuff which is free. The ones that you need to do is this one, Discover DevTools, and try Git. These two are essential, particularly this one, because it teaches you all the different Chrome tools tricks that I'm using. And if you want to be a successful web developer, you need to know how to use these tools very effectively. So that's before, and then append says to add it as the last element, but still inside of it. So append, if I do this, this is appended to the container. And so now it's still inside of this container element that's over here on the left. This is after and this is before. I can also prepend it. And now it's inside the div container, but it's the very first element. So jQuery makes it easy to manipulate these sorts of values. So this only works once. So the second time through, restaurant name, Big Dan Shrimp, 2-star, did not actually have Big Shrimp, lies. I'll submit it. It's going to give me my success message again. It's going to URL encode it again. But this time whenever I reload, I have my first thing, which is Mr. Ying's Wutan, and then my little description down here, and then Big Dan Shrimp, and then my thing here. And the cool thing about this is that once you set it up, and it does take time to actually write out all this code and to make it all look pretty, but you're able to pretty much endlessly append. So I can keep adding restaurants all day long using this, and it's something that, unlike XML, right, you kind of have to know what you're doing if you're just going to hand that off to someone and expect them to work with it. This is something that anyone can use. The downside to it is that all of the, the data validation is all handled by you. So right here, I'm going to store that as a global variable. I told you that I had a little check, so how do I know if there's 1 or 2? Well, inside of here, I look to see what the type of an object is. And so if it's not a type of string, then it has to be an object. If I check this, if I say temp1 dot rating, I say type of, this time it's an object, and the reason why is because each of these has other elements inside of it. So the first time it was only one element, it was just this string. The second time now, using that array merge, it's going to keep adding more and more items to it. So we have to deal with that. Using this return statement here, return false, what this does is that it tells it to stop doing what it's doing. So if I didn't have return false here, this would say do your thing, and then once you're done with it, get out of here. And that's why it doesn't execute any of the rest of the code. That's just so it doesn't attempt to do this part. If this is a string, then this is going to have really bizarre results, because it's going to basically get the index of each piece, and it's going to go, the first letter of Big Dan's is B, and then I, and then so forth and so on. It's going to just put out those one letter at a time, which is not the result that we expect or want. And then I said I would look at the Jquery object. So this object right here, that is the data object return. This is the Jquery object. And basically it tells you what you get back, which here's the raw data that we get back before we make it nice and pretty. This tells us what we get back, and it also gives us things like if the status text was okay and what was returned to us by the server and other good stuff. So anyway, that's pretty much everything. And then finally, I don't know if I demoed this or not, but if I delete this or if it's empty, either one of them will cause the same error condition to occur. And I reload my page. Now I'm going to get no reference have been found in the warning message, and that's triggered by this .fail. And that just means that it attempts to find this file, and if either there's nothing there or when it tries to parse it as JSON, there's no JSON, it throws an error message. And that just lets the user know that, hey, and here you can see that it has a 404, there's no thing found. That just tells it that, hey, it didn't work. And if I do create the file, what is it called? Restaurant.json. If I have the file, but I just have some garbage in there, and I reload it, I'm going to get a different error this time. This time what I'm getting is syntax error. It's going to say unexpected end of input and a parse error, just basically saying, I don't know what that was, because this is not valid JSON. And I actually need to empty this out, because if I start trying to append stuff to it and have that nonsense in there, it won't work. So anyway, that's a very brief introduction to PHP and JSON and how it works. And you can see the advantage of it is that it's much more robust and smaller in size than all the XML. The downside to it is that you do have to spend the upfront time to write out your code and to figure out everything that can go wrong, which is one of the hardest parts of being a programmer, is that users do unexpected and weird things. And so you have to deal with all these variables and conditions. But once you do, you have a nice, flexible, reusable way of allowing people to easily create different things.